One of the areas of theological discussion for the last generation has been the whole question of theology and gender. Megan, you've been working on theology and gender on and off. Can you give us a little brief introduction to what we mean by theology and gender? And maybe a second question is, why is it important?
Sure. So I think it's important to, one of the things in thinking through theology and gender is to recognize that some of these questions are fairly new questions that, so in a sense they are covered in people like Aquinas and Augustine because they talked about sexual difference, but I always like to emphasize that because they're coming from such a different time and a different framework, that they would have asked very different questions about what it means to be male and female, and so many of the questions that we have now in the 21st century about gender are relatively new, and so I think then it's very exciting actually for theology because we have a whole tradition from which to draw from. Some of the resources are helpful, but also we need the creation, I think, of new theologies because the questions themselves are very new. And so then it's kind of creative process of trying to say, how do we remain in some conversation with the tradition and to a certain extent continuity with the tradition, but also address these very new questions. We have new scientific information about gender, new philosophical information about gender, and theology is wonderful because theology is, I think, interested in every aspect of human life and creaturely existence, including gender. So theology definitely has some resources, I think, to bring to some of these questions.
Could you give us an example of some of the resources that theology brings to the whole question of gender?
Yes, definitely. So I think one of the things that theologians have consistently emphasized throughout the tradition is the notion that to be human is to be relational and to be kind of connected to the people around us, and much of what it means to be gendered is kind of relating to those around us, and again the question of desire is very central as well, and theologians from the very beginning have also been interested in desire, and that's also sort of centrally important to questions about gender also. So I think some of the things in the tradition, again with the caveat that they wouldn't have been asking the same questions that we're asking about gender, but still I think that some Christian reflections on relationality and desire still have something to say to us today about questions having to do with gender.
Could I ask you, I'm always intrigued by the fact that when Christians gather, and for as long as we have records they've been doing this, they refer to one another using terms of brother and sister. Mm-hmm. And it always strikes me as a very interesting language to use because it's inherently a language of equality. Mm-hmm. The idea that human beings are a fraternity, you know, the great phrase of the French Revolution, fraternité. Mm-hmm. Everyone should be brother and sister. Mm-hmm. And the idea that human beings are equal, mm-hmm. It strikes me that one of the insights that seems to be there in Christianity, but also forgotten, is this idea that human beings are fundamentally related to one another, mm-hmm. and also related in a way of equality rather than in a way of hierarchy and levels. Now I know Christians have become so obsessed with hierarchy they even refer to their own administrative structures in terms of almost higher levels of holiness and higher levels of being. But it does strike me that in this basic language of brother and sister, there is something about theology and gender that is actually quite subversive of power structures.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right, and I think it's a shame that at various times in the history of the church that gets forgotten, because I think in the scriptures you do have this notion that I think it's the Apostle Paul who has this great verse about there's neither male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek, and but
slave nor free.
Yes, yeah, but all Christ is in all, and all are in Christ. This idea, and so I think that's very organic and authentic to Christianity, and that it gets corrupted at various times by different philosophical systems. I think that people are interested in, but these subversive elements, I think it's important to note that there are these subversive elements all throughout the theological tradition, and so even with someone like Augustine, for his time, in certain ways, he was sort of progressive on some gender questions. And so, for example, he thought women would remain women in heaven, which at the time, people thought to become perfected was to become male. And Augustine said, actually, women were created intentionally by God, and so they're good, and they will remain women in heaven. And so this type of idea, and then also Augustine thought that sexual difference is only in the body and not in the mind, but the mind is actually, there's a sort of common human mind that we all have, sapientia and scientia, wisdom, and then this kind of temporal knowledge that everyone has that regardless of sexual difference. And so in that way, we're equal. And so you do have, even as far back as someone like Augustine, these kinds of subversive ideas. And of course, there's a lot of other problematic things that are also there. But I think now these types of things present resources for us that we can engage with in a helpful way.
Megan, thank you very much.
You're welcome.